It's all about the trenches as we break down the standouts on day one of the Senior Bowl.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka the iron that sharpens the iron, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 20 years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And to become an everydayer, all you have to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today we are coming from you from an undisclosed location in Mobile, Alabama. We're going to be talking all about day one standouts, at least to my eyes. We'll be talking all about the trenches. We'll be talking about some of the offensive linemen that stood out to me. We'll get some random observations, maybe talk a little bit about some of the Georgia guys, what they did or did not do. But we got to start with, what the Falcons or all the future Falcons, right? All those pass rushers, right? That's what we came down here. That's what we spent all that money to get down here to Mobile, to focus on these pass rushers. And we got to start out with sort of the big name edges that are down here in Mobile. A couple of guys that were expected to show up, didn't show up. Nick Scorton, Texas A&M. Yeah, as we suggested on yesterday's episode, a couple of these guys did. We did get confirmation on Tuesday that they were opting out this week. But one person who did not opt out was Mike Green of Marshall, who may be sort of the top edge, pure edge, I guess you could say, headed down here to Mobile. And, looking at the 101s, that's what we were talking about on today's episode. How did these guys look in the 101s? I thought Mike Green looked solid, right? He had a nice rep against Ozzie Trapilo, the Boston College right tackle, with the speed rush. He was able to beat Marcus Mbow from Purdue, I think, with an inside move, although Mbow, I think, kind of set that up because he got way too deep on the set. And there was a couple of times where I thought Mbow was, giving up way too much ground when it came to whether it was those inside moves or power. And so I feel like that was more O-lineman error than necessarily a clean win from Mike Green, but it still counts on his stat sheet. He didn't try to bull rush Ariante Ursary, the big Minnesota left tackle. And that wasn't particularly effective. He sort of got that initial knockback, but Ursary was able to kind of anchor there. He's giving up 88 pounds based off of the Senior Bowl weigh-ins from yesterday. Ursary being almost 340 pounds, Mike Green being barely, 250 pounds. And so therefore, that was a big question with Mike Green. Can he do things other than just sort of speed and finesse moves and whatnot? And the answer today, at least on the sort of 3 reps that I was paying attention to, was no. But again, it's 3 reps. Who knows? We'll have a whole week and hopefully have a lot more reps. Flipping over to the American side, we didn't get as many opportunities from the American team in one-on-ones. And so therefore, Princely Uman Mielen from Ole Miss, probably the top edge or, in the conversation to be the top edge on that American team. He had 1 rep I saw in one-on-ones. He stumbled trying to use an inside spin move, so not really much to write home there. Shamar Stewart, the other top edge on that American team from Texas A&M. From the angle I had, and you don't always get the cleanest angles to watch from the stands, ideally you can get sort of that, behind the offensive line angle, which I think is, at least for someone like me who's watched so much All-22, that to me is the best way to sort of see what these guys are doing. But at least from my angle, Shamar Stewart didn't look like he won either of his reps. It felt like either a toss-up tie between him and the offensive lineman or the offensive lineman won. And he tried the speed rush, he tried a swipe move, and so neither one to me I counted as wins for Shamar Stewart. So not a whole lot to write home. Donovan Ezuraku from Boston College. who I'm sure Jarvis will be talking about because me and him had a conversation about who he liked in that national practice in the one-on-ones, and he mentioned Ezeraku as a guy. He was also, I think Jarvis had an opportunity to talk to Ezeraku after the practice, so you might hear more about that later in the week. But I thought he had one of the cleanest wins, Ezeraku, that is, against Wyatt Millum, the West Virginia offensive lineman, where Millum tried to jump set him. And Ezeraku did a great job swiping his hands. He then tried one of his other reps Ezeraku had was a spin move against Anthony Belton from NC State. And I thought Belton shut that down. So I thought Ezeraku had a couple of good reps. He's another one of these edges that I think is right now in the kind of the day two mix, but could move up boards if he continues to win some of these reps. Josiah Stewart from Michigan, another edge rusher that's sort of seemingly projected to be more of a day two guy. He had a couple of positive reps utilizing his speed. I thought the cleanest win of all the edge rushers I saw today was from UCLA edge rusher Olu Oladejo, who beat Iowa State offensive tackle Jalen Travis with a nasty cross chop. Oladejo also beat Imbo with a bull rush. Again, going back to what I said about Imbo giving up a little bit too much ground. And so Oladejo was a guy that I hadn't really heard of really at all. And so he's a guy that I'm going to have to circle back and watch his film if I can find it. So he popped a couple of times in this practice setting, had at least one rep inside as well, in addition to the edge reps as well. So he's a guy that I'm going to circle back and watch a little bit more because he popped to me. But as I said earlier, we didn't really get too many one-on-ones in the American practice where Princely, Uman Mielen, and Shamar Stewart were practicing. By my count, taking video of it, the American one-on-ones between the offensive and defensive lines went for about 6 minutes. And then they tried to throw in some late one-on-ones at the end of practice. I wasn't recording that, but it didn't look like they went for more than maybe 1 or 2 minutes during that time, in contrast to what the national team did, who was the team that practiced earlier in the day. I saw about 12 or 13 minutes of national team one-on-ones in this practice. So they got a lot of good work. So most of those guys got 2, 3. Some of those guys even got 4 reps in practice on both sides of the ball. And so you got to see those guys trying different things. While, as I mentioned with Princely, I only saw 1 rep from him and a couple other guys. If you were lucky to get 2 reps in the American practice from what I could tell and whatnot. And so hopefully we'll get, an NFL GM or coach, that's going to let them know, this is where the money is made. Let's see a little bit more of these one-on-ones on day 2 of the practice. So we'll see on that. But moving inside, I thought Walter Nolan from Ole Miss, on the 1 rep we saw of him in the American practice, I thought he had a very good rep showcasing his explosiveness and power, things that popped on his film. Deion Walker from Kentucky, the massive 6'7", 340-pound guy, had a nice forklift move on a single rep. Omar Norman Lott, the interior D lineman from Texas, who also I think got some work at edge this week, I thought he got 3 reps in practice. I think probably because he was playing both inside and outside. He had a forklift move where he won. He looked very explosive. And we got to see 3 reps of him. And, because we got to see 3 reps of him, I think he was the guy that stood out to me the most in that American practice in the one-on-ones. Tyrion Ingram Dawkins from UGA, I thought had a good rep when he played out on the edge going up against Jonah Savainaya is how I think it's pronounced. I'll have to double check the pronunciation. The offensive tackle from Arizona in his single rep. But for the interior guys, one guy that did pop similar to Oladejo was Jay Tafuna from Utah. He had a couple of good bull rushes in the national practice. I had heard of Jay Tafuna at least, unlike Oladejo, but I hadn't really watched him. And so he's another guy that I'm going to have to circle back and watch the film of. Cam Jackson from Florida, the big nose tackle, I thought probably had the cleanest win of any of the interior D-line in the American practice, beating UNC center Willie Lampkin with a nice swipe and swim move. And I was talking to my guy, Brandon Olson of Locked On Gators, about Cam Jackson, just because of, we talked about this yesterday or at some point this week about the Falcons' need to potentially add a nose tackle. And I thought Cam Jackson did some good work. So he's another guy that I'm going to have to actually go back and watch the film of. I heard from Brandon what was one of his better games from 2023. So that is a player that I will have to revisit. But, we talked about some of the other big guys I'll tell you sort of what I thought they had. I thought Deion Walker was okay today. He had that one good rep in one-on-ones, and then I thought the rest of practice was just okay. Not necessarily a dominant player, and so that kind of feeds a little bit into the narrative about him having a down year and coming off a down year and all that stuff. Yaya Black, another big, massive guy from Iowa, was, a little disappointing to me in the one-on-ones. He seemed to get a little bit too controlled. As big as he is, he's basically the same size as Deion Walker, but I felt like got controlled a little bit too much. He almost got into a fight with I think it was Wyatt Milam in practice, where they were pushing and shoving, basically because Milam shut him down. We'll talk more about Milam later when we get to the offensive line. Jamari Caldwell from Oregon, 6'2", 342-pound guy, very explosive in his first step, but he kept falling over. He wound up on the ground. I saw him on the ground at least 3 times, twice in one-on-ones, maybe even the third time in one-on-one, and one time in team drills, where it just felt like not to joke about it, but like it just felt like that belly was kind of weighing him down, where he was a little top heavy and wound up anytime because he was trying to fire off the ball a little bit too much. And again, nothing's wrong with it being explosive, but if you can't stay on your feet, you're not going to be able to make the play. And so he wound up belly flopping a couple of times. So explosive guy for his size, but maybe we need to work on that balance a little bit, get him in some yoga or whatever we need to do. But those are sort of the guys on the defensive line and edge players that stood out to me on day one. But guys had to block those guys, and because some guys on the defensive line stood out and didn't stand out, there were a couple of offensive linemen that stood out to me that were able to block some of these guys, and we'll break down them as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it more exciting than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. You can play with over 10 million members, but it's not you versus the other members. It's just you versus the projections over at PrizePicks. It's simple. You just pick more or less against the player stat projections. You got to pick at least 2. And if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your money. PrizePicks is even giving you a free pick for the big game, where one of the starting quarterbacks only needs to throw 1 yard to win. So they basically get a free pick with that one, and you can pair that with one more correct pick, and you're already cashing out. That's how simple it is. And then you can also check out the promos tab and tail any of the Super Sweat Millie winners, big game lineups. And if you tail a lineup that goes 3 for 3, you can win a split of $1 million in promo funds. Download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 line. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, you don't even have to win that $50. It's guaranteed. PrizePicks, run your game. So when we're talking about these offensive linemen that had to block these defensive linemen and edge rushers, a couple of these guys stood out. I wasn't going into this week focusing on the offensive linemen, but basically going through the one-on-ones and watching the film, reviewing it after practice. I'm like, oh, okay, this guy, consistently was winning his reps. And as we've discussed a couple of times with this Falcons team, in addition to upgrading the pass rush, it should be pretty self-evident why we're focused on those pass rushers, because of the Falcons need to upgrade that spot. But, they could use some depth, particularly at the offensive tackle position, where Jake Matthews and Caleb McGarry are getting a little long in the tooth. Both guys are going to be the wrong side of 30 next year, and sort of having a developmental offensive tackle waiting in the wings. Again, it's not necessarily going to be a priority like some other positions on the defense, but maybe in the middle rounds where the Falcons have a 4th round pick, maybe they can acquire some more middle round picks. That's where offensive tackle, and a player that I'm particularly circling because of how he performed, I thought, in the one-on-ones on day one, was Anthony Belton from NC State. I thought he was very impressive in all 4 of his one-on-one reps. He had 2 at left tackle, 2 at left guard. He shut down Ezraku's spin move. He shut down Landon Jackson on the Arkansas edge rusher on a bull rush. He shut down Jay Tafuna, the Utah interior D tackle that stood out to me. He tried a spin move when Belton was lined up at left guard, and he was able to shut that down. And so that NC State connection, Dwayne Ledford, former NC State coach, again, haven't studied a ton of NC State film from this past year, but from what I understand, they still have remnants of that outside zone scheme that Dwayne Ledford installed, 8+ years ago, whenever it was. And Belton's a different type of offensive tackle than what the Falcons traditionally have targeted with some of the lighter, quicker guys and athletic guys. He's a big fella at 345 pounds. And so he's a guy that I'm going to have to go back and watch the film to sort of see, are they still running outside zone? Can he run that stuff? Can he move like you need him to move in an outside zone scheme, as we've talked a lot about diversifying the run scheme? So a big guy like that, like Belton, isn't necessarily someone who's a bad fit for this team moving forward, because hopefully we will start moving away from the outside zone scheme, but that is still going to be the bread and butter of the Falcons run scheme. And so if he can execute that type of scheme, then, he's checking both of the boxes, right? He can do the other stuff outside of outside zone as well as the outside zone stuff. So he's a guy that is intriguing to me because he's not necessarily projected to be an early round pick and could be there in the middle rounds where the Falcons are looking for a developmental offensive tackle. But the top tackle probably at this thing, or one of the top tackles, I should say, or at least the top tackle that actually practiced today, because the other top tackle did more on him in a second, is Josh Connerly Jr. out of Oregon. And I thought he looked the part, right? I thought he, for the most part, won the majority of his one-on-ones. He was able to shut down my boy Oladejo's bull rush there as well. So he looked like a guy that, some people were projecting could be the top tackle off the board, right? Because that's what is kind of up for grabs at the Senior Bowl, where one of these guys like a Connerly could take that OT1 spot if he has a good week of practice. The other guy that I'm talking about that didn't show up at the Senior Bowl, or he did show up, Armand Mimbo out of Missouri. Some people project him more on the interior. Other people think he should be able to stay at tackle because he has, he's, I think, under 6'4" at the official Senior Bowl weigh-in, but had over 34-inch arms, I think. And so that 33-inch threshold is usually the mark for people to basically say, if you're above 33 inches in terms of arm length, you can play tackle. If you're below that, typically teams are going to be like, you got to play inside. But Mimbo did not practice on Tuesday because he missed it with the illness. So hopefully he will be back at practice at Wednesday to, make a competition with Josh Connerly. Ariante Ursary, the big, massive offensive tackle from Minnesota. Again, not super polished, but man, he's so big. As I mentioned earlier, talking about Mike Green and his one-on-one rep with him, it's just hard to get around that guy. So, it's not quite Leonard Davis. That's an old school reference. That's almost a 20-year-old reference for many of you guys. But I remember Leonard Davis back in 01, that draft was, out of Texas. It was like 6'7", 360 or whatever. And it was like, he's just big, long, and you can't get around him. I don't think Ursary's quite, I think Davis wound up being a top 5, top 10 pick. Ursary to me more as a day 2 guy because he's a little bit more polished, but he definitely, if you're just intrigued by the size and the potential, he showed that. Now, Wyatt Millam, who I mentioned from West Virginia earlier, 6'6", 315-pound left tackle at West Virginia, but has sub 33-inch arms, what I'm talking about. And so I think a lot of people are, because of that limited arm length, they're projecting him inside. He did get get one-on-one opportunities at 4 different spots along the offensive line in today's practice: left tackle, left guard, center, and right guard. And the only rep he lost was at left tackle on that jump set against Ezeraku. And so 6'6" is tough to play inside just because of, the leverage battle and the low man wins, that sort of thing, and going up against a lot of D tackles that are 6'2", 6'1", 6'3", etc. You got to get lower than those guys. We saw this with years ago with Garrett Reynolds, who was a college offensive tackle in North Carolina. The Falcons kicked him inside to the guard position, and he kind of struggled in that. Harvey Dahl was, Garrett Reynolds was like 6'7", 6'8". Harvey Dahl was like 6'5". He was able to make that transition inside. And so 6'6", you don't see too many guards that are above 6'5" in the NFL. But, Millam, I thought, if he's going to make that transition, got off to a good start on day 1 and won the majority of his reps in the one-on-ones, showcasing, why he was a bookend left tackle. And that seems to transition pretty well on the interior. Jonah Monheim, the USC center, is probably the top center here at Mobile. showed good hands, good feet in his one-on-one reps, but was very susceptible to power in the bull rush. Several guys were able to put him on skates and drive him into the backfield. So that is going to be something to monitor with him. But certainly I think a lot of these offensive linemen did stand out in their one-on-ones with these edge rushers and interior D linemen. And I think on 2 days ago on the podcast, I talked about sort of the strength of the American team seemed to be on the interior and the strength of the national team seemed to be on the tackle position, and that would matter when it came to these one-on-ones. I thought for the national team and the offensive tackles, that proved true, right? Guys like Belton, Connerly, Ursary were on that national team playing the tackle position. Because we didn't really get to see too many American reps in the one-on-ones, it's really hard to tell if that's proves true that the interior is the strength of that group or whatever. At least guys like Savai Inaya and Mimbu, who some people were projecting to play inside. Mimbu didn't practice. Savai Inaya, I saw the 2 reps he got were both at right tackle. So we'll see on that. So that is going to be something, hopefully, again, as I mentioned earlier, we'll get to see, more one-on-one reps with the American squad on day 2. But speaking of day 2, that's often a big day for folks when it comes to sort of, where you can really make a name for yourself, improving from day 1 or, declining from day 1. And we'll talk about that in addition to, I'm sure some of you guys are very curious how the Georgia guys looked, and at least a couple of guys I have some thoughts on based off of being able to watch them at practice today. And so we'll get into that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So this is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were ever going to get your money back, and then waiting and wondering and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who could do your taxes as soon as today, an expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, and everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is Taxes. Get an expert now at TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. So let's talk briefly about a couple of the Georgia guys that I did notice in today's practice. I wasn't really focusing on those guys too much in that American practice, but Aaron Smith, everybody's favorite Georgia wide receiver, and I use the term favorite loosely. The big issue with Aaron Smith at college was catching the football. And today in practice, he had some issues catching the football. Now, I don't think he had any drop. I didn't see any drops, but there were at least 2, if not 3 times where he had to kind of double catch a football where a ball hit his hands and it bounced off his hands and he had to sort of catch it. And so, if you thought Aaron Smith was going to get rid of that problem, in the month or so since he last played football, you thought wrong. So, Smail Munden, the Georgia linebacker, the handful of times I watched him in the linebacker coverage drills, he didn't really stand out in a positive way. But I didn't think really any of the linebackers stood out in the positive way, so I won't necessarily hammer Smail for that. Trevor Etienne, the Georgia running back, didn't really stand out when I got to watch him. Neither did Dan Jackson, the Georgia safety, as well. Basically, it was Ingram, Tyrion Ingram Jackson Dawkins, whatever his name is, Tyrion Ingram Dawkins, on that one rep in one-on-ones that really, as far as Georgia went, I was like, oh, there's the Georgia guy. They could have easily had good days. I'm not going to sit here and say that they played poorly or practiced poorly or whatever. I just was not really focused on those position groups during it. The one running back that did stand out when I did sort of my attention did stray from the D-line and offensive line was SMU's Brashard Smith. He looked smooth and explosive both as a runner and receiver a handful of times. The quarterbacks, again, wasn't really paying that much attention to those guys. The only time I noticed Jackson Dart from Mississippi was when he missed the throw. Jalen Milroe from Alabama. Every time I was paying attention to him during the football, he seemed to be checking the ball down, so not really a whole lot to say about that. And then Dylan Gabriel from Oregon, he had a couple of nice, decent throws, and so, basically he was the standout to me mostly because it's like, oh, he's left-handed just like Michael Penix. We need to get 2 left-handers on the team. Again, I'm not saying that we need to do that. I'm just saying, like, it would be interesting if the Falcons did try to do that and draft a backup quarterback. But, not a whole lot popped on this first day overall of practice. Sort of as you're sitting there and you're thinking like, oh, this makes me stand out of my seat or anything like that. Again, as I mentioned, a couple of the one-on-ones stood out, but day 2 I think is a big day for a lot of folks. That's a day that a lot of people cite as the kind of the big day. A lot of people leave Mobile after day 2 and basically say we don't worry about day 3 and whatnot. And so day 1 is kind of the foundation day. Day 2 is the day that you can either improve, correct some of the issues that you showed on day 1, or you could fall back down to earth if you get off to a hot start in day 1. I remember Ladd McConkey last year had a great day 1 standout, and then I felt like the DBs kind of made up some ground on him on day 2. Same thing with Michael Penix last year. I thought Michael Penix was the top quarterback on day 1, and then guys like Bo Nix and others were able to sort of make up a little bit of ground on him after that, although I don't think those guys really stood out. It just Michael Penix did not stand out far above the rest of those guys after day 1. So, another position group that I did want to watch while down here in Mobile were the DBs. Did not get a chance to see them in one-on-one settings just because, they're on the opposite side of the field where the offensive line and defensive line one-on-ones are going on. And, you only have 2 sets of eyes. And so you can't watch more than one thing at the same time. And so, one of the things I'll probably wind up doing, on subsequent days, probably not day 2. I'll still probably focus on the trenches on day 2. But maybe we'll get to the DBs on day 3. I've never really had success using the film portal that the Senior Bowl provides where you can look at the film from practice. So if you miss some things, the first year I tried to use it, it didn't work for me. And then last year I didn't try to use it. So this year I'll probably see if I can get someone to help me troubleshoot that whole thing. And that will certainly help tremendously if I can get that working so I can see, all the things that I missed on day 1s and day 2 that I wasn't looking and whatnot. So we will see what happens on day 2, guys. We'll be back with more coverage of the Senior Bowl on day 2 on tomorrow. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, if you want to get more insight on what's going on elsewhere here on Locked On in Mobile, of course, Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL Scouting, we'll have you guys covered on who stood out in their eyes. And I know DP, Damian Pearson, was looking at some tight ends and whatnot. So, if you're in the market for, what's going to be the tight end to replace Kyle Pitts, he might have a couple of answers for you on Locked On NFL Draft. And so check that out. Of course, check out the 2 shows daily on Locked On NFL to get you geared up with all the other big stories going on around the NFL, get you geared up for the big game in a couple of days and weeks. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.